Hello, this is the second part of Seminar 5 and we're still talking about social movements and social action, and I'm looking at the moment at PowerPoint slide 12, and this is a description of what a social movement is, and it's usually a broad-based collection of people who are aiming to change society or address an issue in a particular way or in a number of different ways. Yet generally it is at the nation state level, but sometimes it goes worldwide or parts of the world. It's broader than that. And there's concern with social movements about establishing alternative structures. Some examples of social movements are on slide 13, and in different ways all of these social movements are still current and are still very much alive in the world. The women's movement, the peace movement, the environmental movement, the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement. All of these movements have had different phases, different actions, different leaders, at different times in history, different focuses. So, for example, the women's movement has been driven very much by the concern of gender imbalance and about women's unequal access to resources, to power, to good education, to healthcare, and that movement has had huge impact on the rights and the quality of life of women, and those issues are still very current in many countries, and it's extended to include women's rights to have control over their body, birth choices, access to safe abortion. You know, the list goes on. So many actions are part of the women's movement. I'm not going to go through all of those right now, but the impact of each of these movements is wide and far-reaching. I'll refer back to a couple of these examples in a minute. On slide 14, I want you to think about the ethical considerations for workers. Many of you may be part of a social movement right now, or you might have been part of a social movement at another time in your life. For workers who are paid as community workers, as social workers, as humanitarian workers, there may very well be times when the people with whom you're working and want to take action and want to raise awareness and want to take social action to address inequalities and to have an issue raised and brought to the attention of the public, the local authorities, local government, maybe state and maybe federal government. And sometimes being part of these actions can involve the breaking of the law. And before I point out these questions, we had a conversation in the class about the Black civil rights movement in America in the 50s and the 60s, and the actions that were taken by Black American people to address segregation, to address the racist laws that prevented them from participating fully in life and in the community. And one of those well-known actions is the bus boycott. And in this particular city where the boycott was held after Rosa Parks, a very well-respected and well-trained Black leader in that community, sat down on a bus and on a seat and refused to get up and offer her seat to a white person, and sat in the part of the bus that she wasn't meant to be sitting. A huge action resulted from that, in that the boycott of the buses continued for 13 months until, after many actions, after the local laws were changed to try and force Black people to comply with the law said that they were not allowed to sit in certain parts of the buses. So Rosa Parks and many other people broke the law, I guess, to raise the awareness of the inequities in the system, and to bring to the attention of the government and to the world the human rights that they were missing out on. So to actually raise awareness around that issue, there were actions that people were involved in taking that involved breaking the law, which is, I'm summarising that, making that sound very short and simple, but it was quite a long process, and people were threatened. People, lost their houses. Lots of things happened in that period of time, but also other people in the world knew about it. So it is an example of one of those actions that had impact and repercussions around the world. I guess for workers working in a whole range of situations, there's often not a lot of guidance about how workers make decisions about what they do and what they don't get involved in. So these questions that I'm putting there, they're not my questions, they're GMIFE's questions. And I just think they are useful for us to think about and to consider. Is there a moral justification to break the law? Is it possible for the law to be unjust? Well, yes, it is. So as workers, there may be times when you're in a situation where you need to consider, morally, can I justify breaking the law? And to consider also what might be the personal consequences for doing that. Sometimes the personal consequences can be far-reaching, and they can be consequences that haven't always been well considered at the outset. And I'll just go back to the bus boycott, and an action that began, in 1 month ended up becoming a 13-month action. So personal consequences are very real. And then what are the public consequences as well? These are just some, I guess, questions as a guide for people to consider. If you've read the readings for this seminar, the Mendes article about some actions that were happening in Victoria in the 90s, these questions have come out of that article. So I draw your attention to that if you haven't already read it. On slide 15, we're just looking at what are some of the social movement characteristics, and how do we know that something is a social movement? What are the things that are happening? These point capture some of the main aspects of them. This strong use of networking. Anyone can be part of a social movement. That's the point there. If you are interested in a particular issue, your neighbour might tell you about it, your friend might tell you about it, a colleague at work might tell you about it, and anybody can get involved. So it's non-hierarchical. There are often charismatic leaders. Not always, but they're often the very charismatic leaders who speak passionately about the issue to stir up and to get response and to get people passionate and motivated about it. Multi-centred fluid boundaries, I guess similarly to the strong use of networking. Different people can be part of a social movement and bring different skills and different traits, different focuses. People can come and go from a social movement. People don't necessarily hold positions. It's not the creation of an organisation, it's a movement. Cross-interest groups. So a whole lot of interest groups might be part of a social movement. And, one example is that unions can be actively involved in human rights issues. And, unions are involved in, for example, in Australia, the movement around the treatment of asylum seekers in Australia. There are unions who are active in that. There are teachers' organisations who are active in that. There are doctors who are interested in that and part of that movement. So there's a broad scope for cross-interest groups to be part of that. In for the long haul, as I was saying before with the bus boycott story, often with social movements, the actions the issues go on for a very long time. Days, weeks, sometimes years, and sometimes decades. We have the benefit now of having effective use of internet and mobile phone technologies, which really make communication within social movements so much easier. And people can be part of a social movement that is across the globe, is around the world. People in different parts of the world, different parts of Australia can be part of the same social movement. An example of that is GetUp, for example, which uses social media as its main tool for getting support for different issues. Media coverage and public attention is a critical part of social movement. So we know about social movements because we hear about them on the radio, we read about them in the newspaper, we read about them online, we might see information about them on Facebook because people are posting media announcements about social movements. Without media coverage and public attention, social movement would be considered to be not effective. It's a critical part of it. There's a willingness within social movements to disrupt and to go against social norm. So we talk about social movement is about being active, and that sometimes involves an action that might block the streets, that teachers may not actually go to work because they're striking, so that actually brings that issue to the attention of parents, to the government, to the community around the issues that are facing the teachers. So there's a willingness with social movements to do things, to shake things up. The Occupy movement is, just one example of an international protest that began because of concerns around the economic and social inequality, the domination by the big banks across the globe, and some young people, primarily Canadians, started this. People moved into different cities and set up camps, and what started in one country, in one capital city, spread across all around the world, and people set up tents and peacefully protested by spreading that message around the globe using social media to air their concerns. Another example is the Arab Spring, or the Arab Uprising, that began in 2010, early 2011. And one young man in Tunisia whose job was to sell fruit and vegetables in the streets he was arrested, or his cart was overturned. I'm not sure what happened first, because he hadn't paid a particular fee to be allowed to be selling his fruit and vegetables. And he was so distraught that this man, he actually set fire to himself, and sadly he died. And as a result of his death, there was outrage in Tunisia around the control of regimes that were exercising their power over people's lives and people's need to make a living, about the controls that were acted on people's lives. People, you're probably familiar with this, and that after that, it highlighted people's dissatisfaction with an undemocratic leader in Tunisia. There were protests, and that leader was overthrown. But then what sprung up was protests in other countries that were very similar, other countries that had authoritarian, undemocratic leaders, where the people rose up and really voiced their concerns, and thousands of people gathered in public places, and in Egypt, a similar thing, thousands of people gathered in a public place and demanded for the resignation of the leader there, who also had been in power for 30 years. So what happened in one country stimulated events in other countries, and the way that was communicated using civil resistance was largely through using social media, internet, IT to communicate with people and raise awareness around this issue. And because of the use of IT, we were able to know about this in another country on the other side of the world at the same time that it's happening, so that information is communicated very quickly. I've just really very quickly summarised some really significant movements, and I don't want to make that sound simple or make it sound as though the issues have been resolved, because these social movements, particularly the Arab Spring, highlights the connection with social movements to political movements, and often there is the need to address inadequacies and inequalities, and raising awareness often brings social movements right into the political fore, particularly when leadership is challenged. On slide 18, this is really something for people to reflect on, who are external students, but to think about a social action or a social movement that you've been part of, or maybe you are currently part of, and to think about what the goals of that might be, and what are the strategies and the tactics that are being used or are being used by that social action, and how successful do you see that has been, and what's your role in that as a participant in that social action or that social movement. Okay, that's all. Bye.